So my skeptical mind, and that's just who I am, my skeptical mind goes to, well, yeah, of course, you've got this guy over here that's logical and reasonable, and you got this guy over here that's wearing a tinfoil hat. Of course the tinfoil hat guy's going to see a lot of stuff, right? He's like imagining it, or he's watched one too many sci-fi movies.
But it's used to help us frame hypotheses for UFO propulsion, power, stealth, weaponry.
Everything that we experience is very positive.
Sometimes the field of ufology has a short memory span.
We didn't know anything about the $22 million back then. We just kind of thought, well, this is, and I think that was the reason why they were looking for military-type people, because in the military, you work with whatever you got, no matter what the situation is. You just kind of adapt and overcome.
What are you going to do with all this? You can't even take care of your own files and get them put into the current system, but yet you want to go collect other people's things. So what are you going to do with it? Who are you giving all this to?
Good afternoon, good evening, my friends. I'm Erica Lukes, happy to be here and to get into chat and see all of the familiar faces, all of my loyal friends and listeners who make UFO Classified possible and who are all looking for the same things. We want the truth. We want answers to things. We want to have an exciting process as we're exploring the unknown. And my, what an interesting journey this has been personally for me. I know that from some of the stories that you share with me throughout the week that each and every one of you has a reason that you're here, and I love that. I think that this is such an amazing audience. I respect all of you. You're very kind and grounded, and you care about the truth, and that is really, really wonderful. So thank you all for your support. Tonight I want to talk about Dr. James McDonald and Anne Druffel, because two of these extraordinary people have made such amazing contributions to the field of ufology. And it is my hope and my goal to make sure that younger generations will remember both of these important people. As I have been blessed to hold charge of the Anne Druffel files, every week I know I tell you that I'm making just amazing discoveries that helps me grow as a researcher, and it also helps me connect to Anne, and I feel very, very blessed. Sometimes I go into the archive and just open up a drawer, and I can almost feel her there, and it really is a very powerful thing for me. So thank you for letting me share that with you. She had a book. She wrote several books, but one of my personal favorites, and an incredibly important book, you have to buy this and put this in your collection if you can, is Firestorm, Dr. James E. McDonald's Fight for UFO Science. And in this, she did 10 years worth of research. We're going to talk to her daughter, Alice, who is with us, but we'll explore Anne's process and learn a little bit more about Dr. McDonald, because he was truly a groundbreaker. And I'm going to just read his obituary in the New York Times. Tucson, Arizona, June 15th. Dr. James E. McDonald, nationally known University of Arizona physicist, was found dead in a desert area Sunday in apparent suicide. He was 51 years old. Dr. McDonald was a senior physicist specializing in clouds at the university's Institute of Atmospheric Physics and was credited with contributions to the advancement of cloud physics and weather modification research. Authorities said Dr. McDonald had died of a head wound and that a note and a .38 revolver were found beside the body. A respected scientist, Dr. McDonald, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, was the most outspoken scientific proponent of the possibility that unidentified objects might be under the control from beyond the Earth. In 1968, he told the House Committee on Space Astronautics that the world's scientific community tended to discount and regard things as nonsense. Reports of saucer sightings, serious attempts at studies had been laughed off on court, he said, conceding that this was because of a lack of scientific data. He asserted that the same scientists would not support such collection of data. The tall, sandy-haired physicist with degrees also in chemistry and meteorology was already a respected scientist when he took issue with what he considered deliberate government efforts to debunk UFO sightings. Dr. McDonald held that the Air Force, which had commissioned a study of the phenomena, was blissfully unaware of the serious problem that it had on its hands, in stating that it could explain all but a handful of UFO sightings as natural phenomena or government projects. He believed that UFOs were real and probably came from outer space. He embarked on a speaking crusade 2 years ago, challenging the Air Force's Condon report, in which most UFO sightings were linked to satellites, weather balloons, clouds, birds, and other explainable causes. There is so much more, and I will be posting this, but that just gives you a little idea. Again, this is from the New York Times, about what an amazing, profound, brilliant person Dr. McDonald was, and the contributions he made, not only in ufology, but outside of ufology. I'm joined now with Alice Druffel, who is the daughter of Anne Druffel, the famed UFO researcher, and my hero. Anne Druffel is an environmental advocate and a classical singer, another reason I love her. Since 2009, she has served as the Southern California Outreach Director for the California Interfaith Power and Light, an organization that works with houses on worship, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and policy advocacy. Alice, thank you so much for being here. Again, I love talking to you.
I enjoyed it as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. And so this is, you were up here a couple months ago, and we just had a remarkable time. I was so excited to show you your mother's archives and what I was trying to do with them. And like I mentioned in the monologue, in the opening, every day I go in there, and I mean every day, I'm completely obsessed. And I pull something open, and it's like just this light goes on inside me. And I'm so grateful to have this, to be able to take all of her work and then build upon that. And it's so important for research and for the future of the subject.
Absolutely. It's like religious people say, well, if you want inspiration, if you're a religious person, open the Bible, just point to the passage, and it will give you some guidance on a question you have right now. In your case, it's great that you're going through my mom's files.
Oh, it's so amazing.
And what you're doing, Erica, reminds me of how my mom went through James McDonald's files and was just thrilled and excited to see what she was discovering. So that parallel was brought home just in the last couple of days.
And will you tell us a little bit, just for people that are tuning in for the first time, because I get new listeners every week, but give us a little bit of background on your mom, and then how she decided to really dive into the research that she did on Dr. James McDonald.
So background, I'm sure most of your listeners know, and even new people. My mom was active in the field from 1957 when she joined NICAP up into the mid-2010s with MUFON and other organizations. And she wrote 6 books, almost 200 articles from various UFO publications. And she gave, dozens and dozens of presentations on certain UFO cases. And if I could, I can tell you a little bit about what her daughters remember as kind of her process in writing.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Because my mom had 5 children. The first one was born in 1953. The last one was 1964. And basically, she had such a passion for this subject because she saw what she can only describe as a UFO in 1945 in the summer. And that put it had such an effect on her that people were not talking about quote unquote flying saucers in 1945. So it just marked her life, So she wanted to know the experience of other people, share the experience, be validated, and help solve the question, what is that? So she became very, very interested, excited in the field in 1957. She became a researcher, an investigator for NICAP, and went out when people called, if they saw things in the sky in the Los Angeles area. And thus began, this incredible life of writing. And what her daughters remember most of all is that mainly my mom would put everyone to bed by about 9 p.m., 9:30. And then she would wake up around midnight or 1 a.m. after all of us went to sleep. And she would write for several hours, 2, 3, 4 hours. She kept voluminous notebooks. And sometimes she'd wake up in the middle of the night and write. And she was the kind of person where she would focus on a subject. And it's like her mind went into a zone. She would sit in front of her typewriter, later her computer, and just write. And all of this stuff would just come from her mind, which is pretty amazing. And then when my sisters were very young, my mom would then get up in the morning at about 7 to prepare breakfast and get my sisters to school. So no wonder she took a nap every afternoon.
That's amazing that she had, that talk about a full life.
Mm-hmm. Right. And just this passion. More of her process, my dad actually proofread a lot of my mom's work. In fact, he and I read through the first galley of Firestorm and made edits in the mid to late 90s. And I remember being very impressed by Jim McDonald even then. Another thing about my mom was she went to the Pasadena Public Library, which is this incredible historic library, numerous times. I went with her as a child in the early 70s, all through the 70s and 80s. She was an amazing researcher, and she was on a first-name basis with the research staff there. They pretty much knew her by name and by voice. And she was very, very impressed with Jim McDonald when she met him in 1968 and several times in the mid to late 60s when Jim would come to NICAP meetings. And I am so excited to say that finally we have her website up and running. So if you're able to, you can go to anndruffel.net. It used to be anndruffel.com, but now it's anndruffel.net. And you can go under the articles section, and she wrote. There's 3 articles on Jim McDonald, and you can look at these. They're incredible. One is Remembering James McDonald from 1993 that she wrote. And then Dr. James McDonald's UFO Files from 97. And then scientist and ufologist James McDonald's voice speaks again to researchers in 2006. And would you like to know a little bit about what James himself said about, his desires for his UFOs files to be archived? Great. So I'm reading right now from James McDonald's Voice Speaks Again. So after his tragic death, it didn't take long for his scientific files to be preserved at the University of Arizona at Tucson. It took a while for his UFO files to be such. And part of this article is, after the Condon Report was published in 1969, apparently dismissing all the evidence McDonald and the UFO field had gathered over the years, McDonald decided that he was going to take a sabbatical and write a book, which would be a full rebuttal of Condon's illogical report, as well as a general text outlining the extreme urgency that the UFO phenomenon be accepted as a legitimate subject for study. Now, this is interesting because shortly before McDonald died, he wrote a letter to his wife, Betsy, stating his concern that his voluminous UFO files not simply be burned after his death. He said, it would be ashamed if these were burned, but archived in some form so that capable researchers could use them in future studies. Of particular concern to him were the hundreds of Blue Book radar visual, the RV sighting files, which he had acquired in 1970 at Maxwell Air Force Base, a few months after Project Blue Book was officially ended. So this is pretty amazing. He had the foresight, after the Condon report came out, to go back to Blue Book and copy 580 files of this radar visual. And he was very concerned that these stay for posterity, for future researchers.
And that is so important. And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think that right now, we see there are different periods in this subject where it is very, very easy for the subject to be rewritten. And I think that right now, again, is one of those times, but he could also see that as well, and to have access to work like your mother's, like what Dr. McDonald had accomplished and archived it. This is so important, because if we don't have access to that, then we're spinning the wheel, we're reinventing the wheel.
You're so right, Erica. We have to have the original sources, or else, as through time, what you're saying, things can be interpreted, reinterpreted, and then other people make an interpretation, then someone makes an interpretation on that reinterpretation. Pretty soon we're in Plato's cave, right?
Right.
So he did go back to Maxwell Air Force Base, spent 2 weeks copying these files, and in a letter that he wrote to his wife, he said, quote, "My present best suggestion is that my UFO files be archived at the University of Arizona Library, though maybe they'll view that as presumptuous. Actually, for someone who came along later, that's a mine of UFO material, and library archiving is in many ways the cleanest. It's at least not destroyed, even if only boxed away for years. Its scientific value is, I think, quite large." So he had this in mind. I have a little bit more information from that, but he's saying exactly what you just said, Erica. Archiving is many ways the cleanest way to get, original material. And this is what made me think of you, archiving my mother's materials, and what a wealth of information that was.
Oh, it is incredible. And I have to just say this, and I say this every week now, but your mother was meticulous, and I can picture her, and I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity to come to her home and to see, here's where she sat and looked out the window and talked on the phone to her friends, and then to see this is where she went in the middle of the night to start, researching things, and it was such a pleasure to be in that environment.
That's cool. Well, my mom never forgot Jim McDonald. He was basically the equivalent of a superstar. He was the superstar scientist involved in the UFO field from 66 to 71, even though he had been researching for almost a dozen years before 1966. He came out publicly in 1966. And not to have it's a little friendly competition here, but I really would say that McDonald, not Hynek, was kind of the original, very scientifically based voice that was not afraid to speak the truth. So my mom never forgot Jim McDonald. The whole UFO field was crushed in 1971 with his death. And many people said it just wasn't the same after that. Now, Betsy McDonald had many, many requests from researchers to go through Jim's files. And my mom was one of those. She just wanted to know more about him and his research. So in the early 1990s, she contacted Betsy McDonald. And coincidentally, it turned out that Betsy at the time was also living in Los Angeles. Betsy knew of my mother in conjunction with the Los Angeles NICAP subcommittee. And she trusted my mother in her way of reporting and interviewing and her objective manner, just like her husband's. And so my mother started going to the Tucson house where Betsy and Jim had lived. My mother went there, at least half a dozen times, and went through the files and thought, this man's story and his research has to be cataloged, has to be put in book form. So Betsy, knowing my mom, and they had become friends, gave my mom unlimited 3-year access, exclusive, so no other researchers. And she trusted my mom to write the book on Jim McDonald. And so my mom spent, a total of 6 years going to Arizona, meeting with Betsy. She copied actually some of Jim's files and some of his notebooks. Jim always had notebooks with him. He was like that, little engineer that always has, he's in his little pocket with a pocket protector, So you can just see, Jim McDonald, talking to someone and recording, but also, getting out his book, And he had quite a few books just on the UFO subject. And my mom had access to these. And my mom had a lot of support from not only Betsy, but quite a few of Jim's former colleagues and other people that had known Jim in other in other ways. So so my mom took between 92 and 99, maybe 93 to 2000, researching and then writing. A good 7 years. My sister Ellen remembers that mom went to Arizona all the time. And my mom would, tell us stories. There were dozens of boxes that Jim had saved with information about his work. And, Betsy was a real partner in helping my mom. As I read Firestorm, I can see that Jim and Betsy, though there were strains in the relationship, were real partners, and they supported one another in each of their activities.
What a wonderful thing. And I have to ask you, Dr. Bruce Cornett is in chat room, and he wanted to know if Dr. McDonald left a suicide note.
Well, your intro it said in the New York Times obituary that he did. Correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. That is actually something that I had not really paid attention to, but evidently he did. Even though the issue of his suicide is, a lot of his colleagues in the field just didn't want to believe that. Sadly, he had had an attempt on his life before that. Very tragic. And he was so brilliant, but I think he was prone to just this, like, kind of a breaking point. It's hard to believe that someone so brilliant, someone so full of promise, and the things that he could have done in the future, would take his life. But I think he was kind of led to it too.
You know, it's interesting because in listening to your mom's interviews, the audio interviews that I've been getting, archiving, I mean, she definitely, like a lot of people, I think, had some questions as to, was what happened to lead up to the suicide? Was it really suicide? There were thoughts that maybe he had been poisoned over a period of time and different things. And so it is interesting with regard to that. And he did make another, as you mentioned, another attempt on his life in the month prior to his suicide. But he was under such great stress, personally and then professionally, with everything that he had gone through and all the attacks and public humiliation for his quest for knowledge.
Exactly. And he was ridiculed publicly in front of the Congress in one of the hearings that had nothing to do with UFOs. That was in 1969. So I would, that is a tragedy. But his life and his work just supersede and overcome the way he went out of the world. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I mean, for 51 years, the contributions, and he was, you and I have talked about this before, I mean, he was really looking into climate change and was making such great connections with things. And so there are, he had a life and he contributed so much, as you point out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was the first to speak out about the ozone layer and the threat to the ozone layer if a fleet of TCCs, transcontinental planes that flew in the stratosphere, if they had been built, it would have increased the ozone layer. So they were not built. And he was one of the first people that talked about the ozone layer. I am convinced that had he lived, he would have made the connection from fossil fuels to climate change as well. So, yeah. I was going to just talk about the final archiving trip in 1996 of Jim's UFO files, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Sure. My mom, in James McDonald's UFO files, writes, the final archiving trip was in May 1996. As always, Betsy enthusiastically helped with many of the multiple tasks. By this time, she had been able to move back into her home, which actually had suffered fire damage in 1995. And the 29 boxes which comprised the McDonald archives filled a big corner in her living room. My dad, Charles K. Druffel, paying all of his own expenses, accompanied me, Anne, on this trip and helped with some of the final archiving duties. The personal collections section, personnel, came a few days later to take the 29 boxes to the university's library, University of Arizona at Tucson. In addition to the research materials, we provided computer catalogs of McDonald's UFO library and an itemized catalog of the 1,200 file folders. So, as we know, a lot of researchers, including the folks from, oh my goodness, just escaped me, the show, UFO, sorry, it just escaped me, the show from 2009, they went to McDonald's personal collection and looked through some of these things.
Wow.
So this is pretty incredible. I urge you to go to anndruffel.net to look at these articles, read these articles, learn more about Jim, and you can contact me if you want to buy the book. Do you want me to say my email?
Yes.
So my first name, Allis, like all is, at Interfaith Power, INTERFAITH power.org. If you want to buy Firestorm, it's $30. It's an incredible grand opus of my mom's.
To me, this is one of the most important books that you can have in your collection. And I think you mentioned that, I mean, James McDonald was, when I think of somebody who really brought this subject into a credible light, I mean, he is the man. He is the one person that I can think of that has really done this, and he did it against every odd.
Mm-hmm. Right. And he was lucky to have some support from some colleagues, not a lot, but some colleagues, and Betsy. And I think that's what made this possible, because we didn't see other scientists of his stature enter the field so publicly at that time.
Absolutely not. And even the scientists that were there, I mean, even, with Hynek, I mean, you could see that there was, they had a very interesting, tumultuous relationship. And, there, in Firestorm, your mom does mention a letter that he had penned, to kind of talk about Hynek and question what he was truly doing, what his motivations were. And so that was a very interesting thing. And I know Dr. Jacques Vallee, who knew both men, he always felt that if these two men could have joined forces, that they would have really, truly been unstoppable.
Yes, I totally agree. My mom mentions that in one of the articles, that the publication of Jacques Vallee's Forbidden Science in 1992 somewhat reintroduced James McDonald to the UFO field. But it presents him sometimes in rather negative terms. And my mom thought that if Vallee really understood McDonald's intense nature or his modus operandi, perhaps his ideas on McDonald would have changed, because McDonald, from everything that I read, was very affable, very sociable. He would go into a crowd of people and he could explain things in layman's terms, which is so important. But he was also very intense. And in Firestorm, you read about how he would stay up till 2:00 in the morning reading a file. And he was back at Project Blue Book offices by 8 a.m., like ready to go. So perhaps he was one of the people that didn't need a lot of sleep.
Kind of sounds like your mom was that way too, though.
Yes, but at least my mom took naps. Yes, very true.
And so what, because your mom knew him, I mean, she met him through NICAP, and what were her thoughts? Do you remember her telling you anything specifically about some of the conversations that she had with Dr. McDonald?
I don't think she had a lot of personal conversations with him. It was more seeing him in group settings, like when NICAP would meet, the LA NICAP area lands would meet at Ida Bell Epperson's house. There would be a whole group of people, especially if they knew that Jim McDonald was coming to visit. They would get, 30 people in the room, and he would just regale people with his recent UFO interviews, the cases that he was working on, and people would be kind of enthralled and just so happy. They were so grateful to have this man in their presence and legitimize the fact of their own work, making it not seem like this fringe, crazy subject or that anyone who got into it must be a nut. But this man who is very objective, very scientific, come in and say, yeah, I think we need to look at this very seriously too. So my mom's, I think, probably had very few personal conversations, but she just did describe him as very entertaining, very affable, very sociable, very very approachable, and very well respected. So that he was almost like rock star, kind of almost like a celebrity,
I would bet. And I mean, it seems from the way your mother describes, his demeanor, that he could walk into a room and he had a certain, this air about him. And I can only imagine what it would be like to be in a group of 30 people in Los Angeles and listening to him talk and seeing, the other people that were there as well, because back in, the late 60s, I mean, NICAP, that was a pretty amazing organization with people that were ahead of the game in a lot of regard.
Yes, indeed. Also, James was in his own home turf at University of Arizona in Tucson, was noted for his brilliance as a teacher, his multiple contributions to cloud physics and weather modification, and for his deep knowledge of related fields of science. And he had this inquisitive mind, like his mind did not shut off. He was like a sponge, like a baby, like a toddler just picks up everything. Well, here's a full adult man, and his mind is just going, nonstop. He said he made adventurous forays into any subject that happened to capture his interest, such as the physics of baseball and tennis and the raindrops.
That's interesting. I like it.
There is one other thing in Firestorm that's talked about that shows Jim's foresight into situations that could cause harm. He spoke out vigorously about the fact of ringing like Tucson with anti-ballistic missiles. So his all-out attack on this problem in the early 1960s finally convinced the government that placing defensive missile silos downwind would at least prevent mass civilian deaths from radioactive fallout in the event of a nuclear war. He also spoke out boldly against the war in Vietnam, and especially against the use of napalm and other chemical weapons. Fantastic, such a variety of things that have to do with humanity.
Right, and both he and Betsy were they were just so politically active. And, you mentioned some great things there that really highlight the kind of character he had with regard to caring about humanity, caring about our planet, and it's just, he was just, I wish I could have met him and had the opportunity like your mom.
Exactly. Yes.
And so with Betsy and Dr. McDonald, I mean, they were both kind of involved, politically with some things that I think caught people maybe. There were some interesting things going on, and I know that Gordon Lohr mentions, and he'll mention this in a pre-recorded interview I did about some of the cars, the black vehicles that were following both of them around, or specific exchanges where McDonald had files go missing or things like that. And do you feel that could have been, and I know it's hard to go out on a limb here because he was involved in so much, but do you feel that was perhaps due to the political nature of his feelings, his personal life, Betsy, all of these things, or do you feel that it could have been with regard to UFOs or all of the above?
I don't. Any opinion I have is completely just my opinion. But I think people that were very, very active in the field of civil rights, the war in Vietnam, racial justice, especially things in the 60s, there were files on a number of people kept. I have a dear 94-year-old friend, the Reverend Al Cohen in Pasadena. The CIA had a file on him in the 60s, and he wouldn't hurt a fly, but he was involved in social justice issues. So there were actually people that would go into meetings, go into rallies, and kind of keep track of leaders and people that spoke out on things. So I don't think it's unusual. I think, Jim McDonald just caught the attention of people, especially with Project Blue Book, the Condon Committee. They knew Jim was the scientist out in the front. I also want to correct what I said. I talked about the transporters. It was actually McDonald's last contribution to the field of atmospheric physics in March 1971 was his logical but impassioned argument at a public congressional hearing against government funding for fleets of supersonic transports, the SSTs, which at the time were being proposed to phase out conventional jetliners. That was what I was referring to. I misspoke before, but there was, a proposal to make these things in place of conventional jet airliners. And that's when he said, no, you can't do that. This would damage the fragile ozone layer and cause thousands of additional cases of skin cancer each year. So you can see that he was not afraid. He was not afraid. This is what makes him a perfect example of a person for our times. You have to face ridicule, and you can't be afraid. If you see something, if you see a clear and present danger, you have to speak out, even if it means, personal backlash against yourself. And he did this with the UFO field, and he did this with his own work. And, I don't think he was, quote unquote, political. I don't think he meant to be political. I think he just meant to take a stand on social issues that he saw as threats.
What an amazing human being. Mm-hmm. And like you said, it is so important to take a stand. And it would be interesting to see, now how much, because things have changed so much with the internet and different things, how he would have, and I'm sure he would have been much better than I am in this regard, but how he would have fared with the way the kind of abuse and intimidation has changed arenas, so now you've not only got the professional arena, but you've got all of this, social media and the internet and all sorts of people that pop up that, hide behind anonymity, that do what they can to try to destroy you. And it would have been interesting to see James McDonald today and how he would have acted. And he probably could have taught me a few things.
Exactly. And he probably would have had a couple of intern students that would keep up his social media platforms, right?
Right. That would be good.
Do it. They know everything. The 20-somethings.
I wish I had somebody like that could assist me in my life, or producing the radio show, or any of these things. But it's really just so fascinating. And I want to ask you, what were some of the cases that he looked into that he really felt kind of solidified the deal?
Oh, I can't speak to the exact ones, but he was very struck especially by these 580 radar visual cases that he had copied from Project Blue Book. There were multiple reports at the same time. There's a visual report. There's a radar report. There is support from, the ground radar, whoever's tracking it. And a lot of these are from pilots, Navy pilots. And he was most interested in ones that had the most evidence backing up. So I'm sorry I can't speak to exact ones, but those are the ones that impressed him most. He was also impressed by the Rex Heflin photos as well. And if you go on to AnneDruffel.net, you will see that one of her articles has to do with Rex Heflin. There's the reanalysis of the 1965 Heflin UFO photos. And goodbye, Rex Heflin, your photos remain. Now, when Jim was involved, in the Rex Heflin case, the first 3 original photos had disappeared. So Jim was working on copies of copies sometimes, and you couldn't see a lot of things. And the 4th photo to him didn't seem to match the first 3. But that was before the analysis came out of kind of like the smoke ring that was starting in the 3rd photo and very present in the 4th photo. So he actually he met Rex Heflin. He went to the spot with Rex, where Rex saw the UFO, and had a lot to say about it. And that is covered in Firestorm. So you have to get the book. But he wasn't convinced because of the seemingly difference in the 4th photo. And the main difference in the 4th photo, it was taken from outside the truck, outside Heflin's photo, or outside Heflin's truck. So that's one that really intrigued him as well. But especially these ones from the Navy pilots, I would have loved to seen his reaction when he saw, Commander Fravers' video, and heard Commander Fravers report on what he saw in 2004 and these recent reports.
Interesting to see how he would react. I mean, I wish that there was somebody comparable to him in the field right now, because we could really use him. He was such I know I keep saying this, but he was just absolutely kind, intelligent, and fearless. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And very, he wasn't, he dug into something and he stuck with it. And there was not, I think a lot of times because some of us in UFO, in the UFO world, we don't have a background in science. We're teaching ourselves all of these things. It's a little bit easier for us to waver when it comes to specific things, whereas he was so secure with his knowledge and his background and skill set that it was just, he was, that this is the way it is, and that's how it's going to go.
Yeah, that's really true. And my mom writes that McDonald was, above all, that type of rare scientist who was acutely sensitive to the public's right to know. Wow, that's incredible right there. Not only was he a scientist, he came out of his, quote, ivory tower, as my mom put it. He didn't live in an ivory tower. He went to the people. He was a scientist, gathered the science, came and made it in bite-sized information so people could understand. And I think that's what we need more of. And as we're going toward, hopefully, disclosure, a lot of people think that there is a soft disclosure already happening. I would like to see, like what you said, wouldn't it be great to have these scientists? But of course, we do have people like Bob Wood, and we do have other scientists. But follow this disclosure movement as it's going kind of through the secrecy of meetings in Congress. Wouldn't it be great to have scientists right there and tell the people what's happening?
It absolutely would, and I think we need that. And I think the thing that, we've talked about before, for me, that concerns me is the fact that there are people involved, currently that I believe, and I think this is true probably historically as well, that have political motivations. They have motivations to use the subject as a means to make money, to steer a narrative. And it is, my hope and prayer that this is not taking place now with this current disclosure movement, but that's always a risk of different people being knowingly or unknowingly a part of something that is going on that's a little bit more than what it seems, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah. It's like you want to get the real thing. And like what we were talking about before, original sources. You want to hear from the horse's mouth, whoever the horse is that's speaking. I'm sorry not to say that our Congress people are horses, but I want the original source. Otherwise, we are stuck in Plato's cave, the cave that he described, I think in the last chapter of Plato's Republic. We don't want to be those people that are inside of a cave, around a corner, chained to a wall, and are with our heads not even being able to turn right or left, and just seeing shadows of reality. Mm-hmm. You really want to be there in person and making your own interpretation. And that's why I always like to read what people write for myself, and then I can interpret it instead of allowing someone else to interpret something that's been written. We want to go to those original sources, and I love those original sources for the disclosure movement.
Well, and it's interesting too, because for me and on my journey, and I know we talked about this, sitting around a campfire, which was great fun, and but for me, I found myself pulling away from the American aspect of all of this, and that's why, Norway, which, there's a great clip of Hynek. Before Hynek passed away, he went over to Norway to visit Hesdalen and things, and he said this was a living laboratory, and it really is. That is the place where they're doing some very important work, in my opinion, probably the most important work in the world. And you don't have a lot of this narrative coming in with, the politics or the who needs to be on top in this regard. It's just a very pure much needed way of research and then getting information out to the public. One of these days, we're just going to have to go to Norway. We're going to go to Ireland, and then we're going to recount your mom's steps over in Ireland, and then we'll just hop on over to Norway.
Right. And for anyone who wants to read more about my mom's adventures in Ireland, it's under the Earth Mysteries article, The Search for an Irish Martyr, Robert Emmett. But that's a whole nother subject that has nothing to do with UFOs.
But it's so cool, though. And I think all of us here, it's like we love all of these topics, not just UFOs. There's so much more to life, and it's really quite interesting. And I'll have to have you back again so we can talk about that. And then also, there is a case that Reverend, oh my gosh, help me out, Harris Bailey. I'm having like a moment where my brain is just having. But that is, that's going to take a lot of digging, and that really is an important case that nobody knows about. And I'm so excited to not only dig through the files and archive them, but then to have you talk a little bit about that in the future.
Yes, that is a fascinating one, and I don't see it on her website, and we need to get the excellent article that she wrote about this on her website. But I really appreciate you having me back, and I really appreciate all your listeners and people who support all of this important work that's going on. And please go to AnneDruffel.net.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad that that's back up. And I will be sending you stuff to put on the website, and I hope all of you, and I know there's some mention in chat of wanting to reach out to you to get Firestorm. And this is, like I said, this is one of the most important books that you can have in your library with regard to this topic, because it really highlights an incredible man, his journey personally and professionally, and unfortunately his untimely death at the age of 51. But it's a wonderful book.
Right. And please do reach out to me if you have other questions and want that book.
Absolutely. We will. And thank you so much for being here. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And I know that there are going to be 50 more questions that I will have for you. So just prepare yourself.
Terrific.
Thank you so much. And tell everyone hello for me. Stay safe and everything. And I will touch base with you soon.
Great. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Thank you so much. Thank you. And that was Alice Druffel, and I'm so grateful to know such a wonderful woman. I wish I could have met her mother, but every day I get to go into these wonderful archives and learn from her and her diligent work, and hopefully my work as a result will continue to grow, and I can get more and more information out to the public. So like I mentioned, we aren't reinventing the wheel, which is really critical. For me, making sure that we understand the history of things, to understand the people that were involved with NICAP, to understand the people that were pushing the boundaries with regard to really looking at this from a scientific perspective. These are the people, stories that we need to move forward, and I will do my best to do that. I'm going to take a little bit of a break, but I'm going to start playing an interview that I pre-recorded today with my dear friend, Gordon Lohr. Gordon Lohr was with NICAP back in the 60s and was a friend with Dr. James McDonald, of Dr. James McDonald. And I know in my personal conversations with Gordon, he still to this day is very affected by the untimely death of Dr. McDonald. And Gordon is 85 years old. He's written numerous books and was really a strange effects of from UFOs back in the NICAP days. And so he is just a wonderful source of knowledge, and I'm going to be playing that. And before I play his interview from earlier today, I want to just thank all of you. I want to give Mario, Northern UFOs, just a big shout out for all of his help, all of the people that donate to keep the show on the air, and to help me with my research. I really appreciate each and every one of you. You can go to UFOclassified.com to catch up on the past episodes and to learn some new information coming out, and I appreciate you. So here we have Gordon Lohr in his interview from today about Dr. James McDonald. So I'm just going to record. Okay, so I'm here with my dear friend, Gordon Lohr. Gordon had a wonderful experience with Dr. James McDonald, and Gordon, thank you for being here. You truly are such a legend in so many ways, and your relationship with McDonald was very, very personal to you, and his death was hard on all of you that worked with NICAP. So can you tell us when you first met Dr. McDonald?
Yeah, I first met him in 1967 when he came into the NICAP office in Washington, D.C., where my late wife Marty and I showed him around the offices and led him into the large room where approximately 12,000 UFO sighting reports were stored. And he spent about 3 hours there, and then he returned amazed about the numerous unexplained UFO sightings by eminently qualified individuals, including airplane pilots, police officers, military personnel, scientists, engineers, and many others. And he said he was overwhelmed by the number of qualified personnel who had seen objects that defied the laws of gravity. He even studied a few of the alien abduction cases, including the one by Betty and Barney Hill in Exeter, New Hampshire in 1961. And McDonald kept in touch with us and worked with Dick Hall, who was then the assistant director of NICAP, Major Donald Lee Kehoe, who was known as Mr. UFO, and myself in obtaining prominent scientific speakers before the House on Science and Astronautics hearings in the U.S. House of Representatives on July 29, 1968. He actually stunned many of his colleagues and others when he testified before Congress. Quote, the hypothesis that UFOs are ET surveillance objects I regard as most likely, end quote. And from there we went on. Of course, he also worked with us on the infamous Condon Report from the University of Colorado in 1967-68 up into 1969. And he was an indefatigable guy. He could just go for like 20 hours a day almost, and not get tired. He said he was overwhelmed by the number of tremendous reports by highly qualified individuals that we had in our office.
And so you had this initial meeting with him, and he was kind of taken aback at the quality of what you had in the NICAP files. And so after that, how frequently did all of you speak with him?
Oh, we spoke with him whenever he came into Washington, D.C., which was fairly frequent, to either testify before Congress at one of the meetings or just on other business. Sometimes he just came in because he wanted to come in and meet with us and discuss UFOs and find out what else we had done at NICAP to help promote the best quality UFO sightings. And he has supposedly said he was interested in later years. He said he was supposedly interested in doing a book himself on the subject, and that he was collecting some information on that, but unfortunately he passed away before he could get that book done.
And that is, it's most unfortunate. We'll talk a little bit about his tragic death. But when you first got to know him, what were some of the things that really struck you about his personality?
His personality was, he had a strictly a scientific personality. He was out after the truth. He even looked into some of the alien abduction cases and stuff like that he first of all discounted, and then said, well, maybe there's something true. There's something about this. He found that people like Betty and Barney Hill and others who had reported being abducted on board alien spacecraft, he says some were very interesting, well-qualified people, and that he couldn't find any reason they would make up such a story. And then he began looking at some of our other files on alien abduction cases and began to realize that there was something there, but he wasn't quite ready because he knew that if he came out in favor of these reports that he would suffer scientifically from it, from his colleagues. But at the same time, he kept at it, and Dick Hall and my wife Marty and I were great friends with him. He visited our home in the Carter Rock Springs area of Bethesda, Maryland, and stayed overnight when he visited Washington, D.C. for whatever purpose. Mostly it had to do with UFOs.
So let me ask you, because I know that it was very difficult for him as a well-respected scientist to come out and talk about this. What type of blowback did he start receiving because of his willingness to broach this topic? That'd be hard to explain. He was, I think it was gradual, but he began to finally come in contact with a select group of scientists that he was very impressed by, people that he knew that were also into studying UFOs or some of the good aspects of UFOs, and to be able to tell the difference between what was a bona fide UFO report that required further scientific evaluation and what could be hoaxes or people who were trying to pull a fast one, as he put it. And so he received, his unfortunately his career was, he was under the spotlight a lot, and there were people who had a vested interest in really knocking him back and discrediting him. Can you give us specific examples of the people and experiences that he had with regard to this, because it took a big toll on him personally?
Yeah, it did, because one thing he considered most of all was his own impeccable reputation of being a highly qualified, honest, mature scientist who wouldn't be persuaded by people who had a totally negative aspect toward the subject of UFOs without first looking into it, as he did. At first he said that he was totally skeptical. He was one of the big skeptics before he came into our NICAP office that day and spent about 3 hours going through all our cases, and he just came back totally amazed about the cases he found from airline pilots and military personnel and police officers and scientists and many others.
What about Phil Klass?
I don't remember too much about what he said about Phil Klass. He regarded Phil Klass as one of the scientists who just seemed to poo-poo the subject without really studying it in any in-depth way. And McDonald admitted that he was totally skeptical of the subject, but then after he spent the 3 hours or so in the NICAP office, he was his mind completely turned around about that. He says he wasn't, he wanted to do more research, which he continued to do right up to the time of his passing in 71, 72, something like that.
Yes, and so when he established a relationship with Kehoe and Dick Hall, can you describe a little bit about what their relationship was like?
Well, he didn't have a lot of direct communication with Kehoe, but he did with Dick Hall and myself, because we were there in the office. Kehoe was seldom there because he lived in about 120 miles away, and he was most impressed. He considered Kehoe as one of the true pioneers in the field. He thought Kehoe lacked perhaps the real scientific credentials that he would like to have seen, but he's highly respected. He regarded Kehoe as the one person that really persuaded the public that UFOs, that a certain portion of UFOs, about 20% perhaps, were real objects and could well have been surveillance objects from other planets in our solar system.
And so what, with regard to Dick Hall, I mean, I know that he and Dick, I mean, all of you had a relationship, and so what type of, just describe a little bit about that and some of the interactions, if you can think of anything specific that he had with Dick Hall.
Well, he was, as I say, whenever he came into D.C., he usually stayed at our place in Bethesda. And he would stay up till like 4 o'clock in the morning discussing UFOs and how he was interested in doing that. And as a matter of fact, we found out he was not only interested in UFOs, but in certain psychic phenomena as well, including table tipping and divining and whatnot. But it was UFOs that was really his own thing, and he was right. And he told us early on that he was interested in eventually writing his own book on the subject. Unfortunately, that never came to be, although during his last visit with us, about 6 weeks or so before his untimely death, he said that he had a whole series of little black books which he would take out of his pocket when he was with us and make notes of particularly important things that he thought were important, and stashed them away.
And then the
at the end
never
there,
been found.
No, they've never been found. Matter of fact, I think Anne Druffel, when she went to do her great book on Firestorm, Dr. James E. McDonald's Fight for UFO Scientists, because we told her, or I told her specifically about the black books, and she said she had heard that as well, but they were never found. And these books contained copious notes on what he thought about the subject and things that he wanted to check into. He also had a couple of experiences on airlines. So I remember one when he told us that he was on an airline flight from his home to D.C., and he mistakenly put his briefcase down on the seat beside him, extending out into the aisle instead of on the uppermost portion. And when the plane landed, his briefcase with his UFO reports that he wanted to keep were gone, but an identical suitcase that was totally empty was there. And he said that happened twice on various flights. So he knew he was being surveilled. By whom, he didn't know, but he said that he was even followed around with by black vans with no license plates around his where he lived in Arizona.
And you know, some of that it is interesting because both he and Betsy had interesting. They were very politically involved, specifically Betsy, and so you know, was the fact that they were being surveilled, did that have to do with their political leanings, or did that have to do with some of the research that he was working on with regard to UFOs or things? What is your thought on that?
No, well, he seemed to give us the impression that it was definitely due to his making ground, as I would call it, on the UFO phenomena. I mean, he was the one that really, you know, he gave speeches before the United Nations, even one or two, and he had when he passed away, he had just thousands of pages of his own reports, many of which I have myself here, about how he regarded UFOs as a study that not only should but must be must be studied by prominent scientists and others who could bring more light and clarity into the UFO subject. And of course, all of that's still going on today with other people, but nobody's yet found somebody that had the tremendous spirit and dedication to studying the object as did Jim McDonald. And his loss by an apparent suicide was just shattering to us all.
And so what was his relationship like with Hynek? Because from my understanding, that was a very tumultuous relationship, shall we put it?
Yeah, well, he considered Hynek as somebody that was well versed in the subject, but was just completely negative toward it. As a matter of fact, he was in Hynek's office one day, and he got so angry at that, and McDonald rarely got angry, but he just sort of slammed his fist on Hynek's desk and says, "Damn it, Alan, why can't you get a more scientific attitude toward this subject?" He says, "There's so many good reports out there that need to be studied. Why not do it?" And then Hynek just sort of looked at him and says, "Well, I don't know." You know, but I think he got that. And when I visited with Hynek myself for a full day, I visited with him and Jacques Vallee. He mentioned that. Hynek did to me, and sort of smiled as he put his pipe down onto his. He says, "You know, Gordon, he hit my desk so hard that my pipe flew off of its mount and onto the floor." So, but I think that was about the time that Hynek began his turnaround from being totally negative to a more scientific attitude toward the subject.
And so with regard to Vallee, Dr. Jacques Vallee, because he was more in the Hynek camp of things, what was his thought on all of this, and what was his relationship like with McDonald?
Whose relationship with McDonald? You mean
Dr. Vallee?
Oh, Vallee. Well, I can't recall that Vallee had much correspondence with him or anything. He may have, but Vallee, of course, we soon realized, because I did spend a day with him, and he was telling, and Vallee particularly, I spent most of the time with Vallee, and he was telling me that really something that he didn't want repeated at the time, but he said that part of his job, he thought, was to try to persuade Hynek to be more scientifically oriented toward studying some of the more reliable UFO reports. And he said he even had to sometimes slam his fist down on Hynek's desk to try to get him to do that. I think eventually he did, because Hynek later came out, as you know, and came out with a much more scientific attitude toward it, and even wrote several books on the subject, as did Vallee.
And so, and it did seem like there were, there was the Hynek-Vallee kind of faction, and then, McDonald and perhaps you and things and so there was, the people were a bit at odds with that. And from what I understand after listening to an interview that Anne did with, Vallee, I think Vallee later regretted perhaps some of that and the relationship, and really wanted to see, regretted the fact that Hynek and McDonald couldn't put their heads together and move in a positive direction.
McDonald and Vallee, or
McDonald and Hynek.
McDonald and Hynek, yeah, okay.
And so, and it's just all very, very interesting. And so, when you look back at McDonald and his particularly important contributions, what is when you were there in '68 when he was briefing Congress? Tell us a little bit about that particular moment and some of the highlights.
Yeah, he worked with us with Dick Hall and Kehoe and myself, entertaining very prominent scientific speakers before the Committee on Science and Astronautics hearing at the U.S. House of Representatives on July 29, 1968, and he actually stunned many of his colleagues when he testified, quote, "The hypothesis that UFOs are extraterrestrial surveillance objects I regard as most likely." And he didn't come by that just off the cuff. He had spent at least a year or more before that really digging deep into these particular reports, beginning with the time he showed up at our office. He said he'd only had about 12 reports he thought were bona fide reports from qualified people, but when he left our office, like 3 or 4 hours later, he extended that by quite a bit. So he was on his way then. He worked quite a bit with Dick Hall and myself during the intervening months and 2 or 3 years before his passing.
And so tell us a little bit about, too, with his relationship with Betsy and some of the kind of the turmoil that he had towards the end of his life.
I don't know a lot about that. I had heard that Betsy was very much involved with the Black Panther individuals that was prominent back in those days, and that she had fallen in love with somebody else, whether it was one of the Black Panthers, I don't know for sure, but he was very distressed by that, I do know. And of course, McDonald himself, we later found out, suffered from sort of a bipolar disorder. He constantly fought that, and which may have been one of the things that prompted him to commit suicide. And
that was tragic, and there was, that was his second attempt at suicide within a pretty close time frame. And there are questions that people have put forward, including Anne, about perhaps the state that he was in. Could it have been induced by specific chemicals? Could he have been poisoned? Could there have been some sort of influence that was not just him committing suicide, and that would be the reason that his life ended? What are your thoughts with regard to that? Because I know that's been a question that has been floated around for decades.
Yeah, well, I don't know. There may be some credibility in that, but I really don't know about that. I think it had mostly to do with just his bipolar disorder, because, if you have bipolar disorder, it can be, 1 minute you can feel on top of the world and feel happy and gay, and the next you feel like committing suicide. It can go to that extreme realm. So I think it may have had more to do with that than anything else. I don't know, because McDonald wasn't afraid of showing things, showing the truth as he regarded it in a scientific manner, and he was roundly criticized by many people, and was some said that he should be thrown out of the scientific profession because he studied UFOs so much. But we always found him to be very objective and whatnot, and we knew he had this condition. We just didn't know how serious it was. So when we found out about his passing, it just shocked us beyond belief. We couldn't believe it at first. Yeah.
And so with the other people that were at NICAP during that time period, did he have any communications or relationships with some of the people that you worked with besides Hall and Kehoe?
Not that I can recall. It's been so long ago now, memory fades on a lot of this stuff, but I can't recall that he did. As far as anybody in the NICAP office is concerned, it was just Marty and myself and Dick Hall. Very little with Kehoe, actually. He talked with him a few times over the phone, but that was about it.
And so what, when NICAP really, with Stuart Nixon and some of the things that took place and your removal and things, what were his thoughts about what took place with NICAP at that time period?
Oh, gosh. Well, he had suspicions, like we did, that it was being taken over by the CIA, and which I think was certainly true. Ever since Stuart Nixon came on the staff in 1967, I believe it was, I suspected him of being a CIA plant. I tried to persuade Kehoe of that, but Kehoe wouldn't buy it. I suspect that a CIA operative, possibly Joseph Bryan, who later became chairman of the NICAP Board of Governors, was a CIA agent. I suspect that he and others brought Nixon on board with the idea of really wiping NICAP out, at least under Kehoe's reign, and turning it over to the CIA. And of course, I was ousted on the same day that Kehoe was, in December of 1969, and was not even allowed in my office to get my personal stuff before I just burst in there, almost knocked the door down getting in there to get my personal stuff. And they said they were going to call the police unless I got out quick. Well, I got out quick and never looked back.
Who specifically said that? Do you remember?
Who said what?
Who said that they were going to call the police?
Oh, Stuart Nixon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, it would be wonderful to have the opportunity to talk to him. I believe he's still alive, and I'm sure he has quite a few stories to tell about everything. Do you remember...
Who is this? Nixon you're talking about?
Yeah, Stuart Nixon.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, as far as I know, he hasn't passed away. He's got to be up there in age as well, so...
So do you remember any specific, you've mentioned the Betty and Barney Hill case. Were there other cases that you can remember that he took a great interest in?
Oh, gosh, as I say, memory kind of serves. There were a number of cases, and can you hang on a second?
Absolutely.
I want to get my book here, and I think I can maybe give you some input on that. Hang on. There was the Carl Higdon case. You remember that one?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, that was 70s. One he thought was...
Wasn't that what year? Wasn't that back in the early... No, when was Higdon?
I don't know. I think it was maybe 67, something like that. Yeah. Let's see.
I know the Heflin case. That was something of interest. Yorba, Linda.
Oh yeah, that was in August of '65. Right. Although there's some story about how that may not be a bona fide case that has come out recently, but as far as I know, it is. I have that in my book. Flying Saucers from Beyond the Earth. Although it's always kind of bothered me that the object was so small, but then it could have been a very tiny object emitted from a mothership somewhere way up in the sky. See, I have one thing here. I'd like to read to you about Stuart Nixon here. Sometime after I became the NICAP assistant director during the summer of 1967, Stuart Nixon, a cocky young man, came to NICAP as a new staff member. Keogh later told me that Nixon had been hired as a favor to a friend. As he continued, I got the idea that the friend may have been Colonel Joseph Bryan, chairman of NICAP's Board of Governors. During his first week, Nixon approached my desk and with a somewhat stumbling aura of authority announced, "Gordon, I'm here to coordinate some changes that will need to be made." Suddenly he drew back as if he had said too much. "What changes are you talking about, Stuart?" I asked. "Who sent you here?" "Oh, never mind," he nervously replied. "Sorry, I shouldn't have said anything. I'm just here to help you guys through the rough time." A red flag had been sent up. Shortly after that, Stuart told me that the NICAP photographer, William McIntyre, who had also mysteriously came into the picture at about the same time as Nixon, had been shut down in his helicopter in Vietnam in 1965. He was supposedly on a secret mission with the CIA. Stuart openly remarked with some degree of admiring glee. Well, it didn't take me long to wonder if Nixon may have been sent there to recruit me for a possible CIA takeover in NICAP. I had heard from Dick Hall that two of the agent's operatives had visited NICAP office before I came on board, and they spent several hours scrutinizing the sightings reports. I soon realized that Keogh himself may have opened the door to that eventuality by appointing Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, the first director of the CIA, chairman of the NICAP Board of Governors. The Admiral and Keogh had been friends since their days long ago as cadets at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. And other board members had also been CIA operatives. So, unfortunately, Keogh unintentionally kind of stacked the board with CIA members because he thought they would add credibility to the subject, and indeed they did for a while.
Interesting. And so, do you remember when James visited Australia?
No, I don't. I do know that I'd heard that he did, but I don't remember any conversations with him in that regard.
Okay. And when because you mentioned that he had an interest in parapsychology and table tipping and different things, can you describe maybe one of the times where all of you were together and you were exploring some of these aspects?
Yeah, I can remember twice, and table tipping and divining were two, and they happened on the same day, because when you're table tipping, you know, the table sometimes rocked and so on, and it did to such an extent that it rose up in the air, came back down a couple of times, and just sort of rocked back and forth. And McDonald was so taken back to that, he got out of his chair, and he actually crawled under the table to see if anything was under the table that could be causing the severe rocking that occurred. And he could find nothing. And then later that same day, Dick Hall and I told him that we were interested in things like divining. So he got what he called a divining rod, which is sort of sometimes they were sort of tree branches that were formed into divining rods. And we went out there, and sure enough, the rod started pulling down, and all three of the instruments that we were holding. And McDonald almost dug up the ground to see if anything was planted under there that could cause that. But he was totally amazed by that, and they both happened on the same day.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I'm sure that people that are more skeptical would take something like that and run with it.
Oh, sure, yeah. Even today, I mean, you know, that's very true. Yeah. Of course, back in the days, you know, the UFOs were much more widely reported. And, I mean, there were blazing headlines from all around the world of prominent UFO cases. It's just not the case today. There's just too much other stuff out there that people contend with that, you know, even books on the subject aren't selling all that well anymore.
Well, it's definitely, you know, the Internet's been an interesting thing for the subject.
Yeah, both pro and con.
Bad, you know.
Both pro and con, for
exactly,
sure. Equal measures of both.
Absolutely. And do you know any specifics on, he was working on you know, cloud seeding. He was working on, you know, he was one of the first people to sound the alarm on the on global warming. And do you remember any specific thing with things like that with regard to his professional career that he was working on that he might have talked with you about?
No, I can't think of anything in that arena. It was just had mostly to do with UFOs, and that was it. You know, I can't recall. He may have, but my memory isn't that good anymore.
Well, I hear you on that one. Some days might be better than others, but...
I know. I sometimes forget your name. I think it's Broomhilda, isn't it? No, I'm kidding.
Of course it is. Of course, I like that. Oh, that's funny. And so just your closing thoughts on Dr. McDonald and his contributions and the legacy that he leaves for all of us.
Well, I think that the legacy he leaves for all people who are very interested in the scientific research on the UFO subject. He left an enduring legacy. I think anybody that knows him or knew of him even, because he was the one individual that Dick Hall and I and others considered as the one scientist who could single-handedly turn around the subject to a more authoritative experience scientifically. We couldn't think of anybody else. I mean, the fact that he was sort of a skeptic when he came into our office, and just a few hours later began his turnaround after he reviewed the 12,000 or so reports in our files. But that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's very exciting to hear you talk about all of this, because you actually knew him and had the pleasure of getting to know him. And I know his death, as we've talked about many times, was very, very hard on you. And
yeah, it still affects me to this day.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. I know it. He was really something. I wish there had been more like him, but these things keep on, and reports still keep coming in, even though you don't hear that much about them anymore. It's just there's just too many other things going on, too many other people in the world, too many other things that they want you to concentrate on. So what used to be blazing headlines all around the world are no longer there. They just, even though the reports continue to be coming in, there's just too much other stuff going on to discourage any scientific review anymore of UFO reports. Some of that's going on, but not to the extent that it was back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s even.
And so that was my dear friend and one of my wonderful mentors, Gordon Lohr, who wrote Flying Saucers from Beyond the Earth. You can go to Amazon to purchase his books. He really has been such a wonderful person to me, to give me information about NICAP, which was so pivotal with regard to UFO research. And I want to just take a moment, because I have in front of me a letter that Phil Klass, who was by some accounts quite naughty to Dr. McDonald, and was well, actually, he wasn't very nice at all, but that's okay. That's another story. But I want to just read this with you, because it's just quite interesting. This is in one of the files that I have from McDonald's archives that Anne Druffel so diligently put together over many, many years. And in this, it is dated April 22nd, 1969. At the very top, written in pen, it says, "Don't throw it away. I agree with you!" ! It says here, "Dear Jim, despite the many areas of disagreement in our views on UFOs, I very much like your idea the responsibility for UFOs should be transferred from the United States Air Force to NASA. I'd not really given it any thought prior to reading your paper today, but the more I think about it, the more sensible it seems. If your present UFO hypothesis is correct, then NASA is obviously the natural agency to get involved. And if mine is correct, the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center scientists are probably the best collection of people to root out the terrestrial phenomena involved. However, I think that this is not the right time to push for such change. Rather, it seems to me that the idea ought to be planted at the University of Colorado, with the idea that their report might suggest continuing studies and as NASA as the logical agency to conduct them. I'm sure that the Air Force would be happy to bow out of the picture, as you've stated, that NASA has other pressing problems on its mind, or at least on the minds of the top officials whose support would be needed to take on the task. That is another reason why I think it would be wise not to press the issue too hard in the public at this time, but use more subtle approaches. So that was from Phil Klass. And it is really interesting to me to read this and to see him pushing things towards NASA. Very, very, very interesting indeed. And so I look forward to sharing more of this information with you. But right now, what I want to play is just a brief portion of an interview that Anne Druffel conducted with Dr. Jacques Vallee. And this was in regard to Firestorm. And it's just very interesting. And so just imagine for a moment kind of being a fly on the wall and listening to this conversation as they review the book and talk about different changes. And this is just a portion of that, just to give you a little bit of an idea. And so here this is Dr. Jacques Vallee, one of my heroes, and Anne Druffel.
Let me ask you something that has, now that you found these diaries, how naive was Jim McDonald? I mean, how naive was he with respect to the classified, the secret studies that were going on around that time? Did he stumble on any of that? Was he privy to any of that?
He knew about Air Force Regulation 200-2, where the Air Force personnel couldn't talk to him. But they did talk to him. And there's several cases in the journal of confidential cases, with names and everything like that.
But beyond the confidential cases, was he aware of confidential studies going on?
I don't believe so. No, because he never was convinced that there was any cover-up at all. He ascribed to the foul-up theory rather than the cover-up, in spite of people having long conversations with him. But there are some ufologists that say he was beginning to get to the cover-up hypotheses, or the idea of a conspiratorial cover-up toward the end of his life. That's one of the reasons I wanted to ask you. This is one of the questions I wanted to ask you. I've found 3 people that I've interviewed who said that that just a few weeks before he died, he was talking with high-level people in the government, and that he was onto the answer, and that he wasn't able to talk about it now, but he would soon. And one person gave a 2-year, period of time that this could come out. So, did you know anything about this?
No. Did he write that anywhere, or was it indirect?
It's not written in here. It comes from three of my interviewees. But strangely, nobody in the field, nobody in his own field of atmospheric physics, the people at the University of Arizona know nothing about this, or at least they claim to know nothing about it. But he told 3 people in ufology basically the same thing. And this was just about 2 months, 6 weeks before before
his first attempt?
Before his first attempt, yes.
Was he still writing in his diary then, at that time?
No, the last thing about the diary is on St. Patrick's Day in 1971. And he had just come off, I think in January 26, he had tried once again with Hynek. Hynek had come to town, and he says that they left feeling, very, very angry at each other, so to speak.
I can confirm that.
And then this one that's a 3. That's the way he made a 3.
Su Shu Wang, dropped in. Su Shu Wang was an astronomer at Northwestern.
Oh, I didn't know that. Could you spell that for me?
Yes. Well, he's in Forbidden Science, I think.
Yes.
I think it's SUSHU H-U-A-N-G, just as he spells it here. Yes.
Okay, fine. I'm glad to have that
it's
because...
Chinese. It's a Chinese name.
Okay, and he was an astronomer at
Yes.
Northwestern?
He was an astronomer that Hynek brought to Northwestern.
Oh. Okay.
Probably under S, if it's in there. Yes. It's Sushuran. This index
Page
probably
160.
has many of the same names as he mentioned.
Oh,
Probably
yes,
has
I'm
another-
sure that it does. Wonderful, because Shushuan Huang couldn't understand how he felt about Hynek, and he tried to talk to him, but I guess Jim just spoke so fast, and he was so hurried. Or Shushuan was hurried. He was at a conference there and had to get back.
I favor ETH. To my surprise, he...
I could bring that up on... You want to see that on the...
Yes.
Okay. See, these are all interviews here. And wait a minute.
You're doing a wonderful, wonderful work here.
Oh, well, thank you.
This is very valuable. I mean,
It's not going fast, but it's certainly absorbing.
Well, that is certainly just a little interesting fly-on-the-wall kind of moment. Just imagine yourself sitting at a table, and I've sat at that very table looking over a beautiful garden and having Dr. Jacques Vallee there, who has contributed so much to this field over the decades, and having a conversation with Anne about Dr. James McDonald. And it was really, the whole conversation is fascinating, and I'll be playing more pieces from not only that interview, but also other interviews, as I have done previously, that Anne has conducted, just to give you a little flavor of her style. She was so eloquent, so calm. I could learn a lot from her in that regard, but it's just fascinating to me to hear these candid exchanges, and we can learn so much about all of that. And now, before we go to the end of the show, before we get to the end of the show, I want to read a little bit of a paper from Dr. James McDonald from the University of Arizona, and this was in March 1968. The title is Are UFOs Extraterrestrial Surveillance Craft? This is an abstract of a talk given March 26th, 1968, before the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics at the International Hotel in Los Angeles. If it were insisted that I limit my entire talk to one-word answer to the question posed in that title, I would say, probably. Surely AIAA members would wholeheartedly agree that if there were even a slim possibility that the Earth was under the extraterrestrial surveillance in any form, that would be a matter for the greatest scientific importance, warranting the most vigorous investigation. In fact, the evidence that seems to point to the conclusion that UFOs could be such devices is far from negligible, yet because of the history of its official and scientific responses to earlier UFO reports, we continue to see neglect or ridicule of this intriguing question. After nearly 2 years of intensive study of many facets of long-standing UFO problems, after examining around 1,000 UFO reports and directly interviewing several hundred witnesses in selected UFO cases of outstanding interest, and after weighing alternative hypotheses, I find myself driven steadily further towards the position that extraterrestrial hypothesis seems to be the most probable hypothesis to account for UFOs. That hypothesis is, of course, not original with me. It has been urged for many years by persons knowledgeable with respect to the UFO problem who spoke from outside scientific circles. Our collective failure to examine scientific aspects of the UFO problem will, I fear, be held against the scientific community with the full dimensions of the UFO evidence come to be recognized. And the later date may not be far off. The principal points which I wish to emphasize include the following. For the past half a dozen years, our American space program has been keyed to the search for life in space. Yet now the impressive UFO evidence that life may, in some sense, already have found us is either scoffed at or wholly ignored, even within such space-oriented agencies as NASA. I speak from first-hand experience in making that criticism. 20 years of the United States Air Force responsibility in handling UFO reports appear to me to constitute very nearly that many years of superficial and scientifically incompetent response to the UFO problem. Aside from brief periods in 1948 and again in 1952 to 53, United States Air Force investigations of UFO reports have been perfunctory, aimed generally at finding any explanation, however inadequately it might match the reported facts. The principal reason that no other adequate scientific investigation has ever been initiated has been that despite almost complete lack of any scientific expertise in the United States Air Force program, Project Blue Book, public pronouncements have repeatedly given strong assurances that the investigations were drawing upon the best scientific talent available to the Air Force. Nothing could be further from that fact. The present Air Force-sponsored study at the University of Colorado offered promise initially. However, repeated indications of negative bias in public statements by the project director combined with a lack of vigorous investigation of the most provocative types of UFO cases reported over the past 20 years suggest that the Colorado program will fall short of the required level of investigation. It is very desirable that some program be set up entirely divorced from the Air Force affiliation, a conclusion underscored by my recent developments. I have just returned from a visit to Canada where I spoke before the Canadian Aeronautics and Space Institute at their March 12th Montreal meetings. I emphasized the likelihood that a UFO investigatory program in countries other than the U.S. may have distinctively better chances of making rapid scientific progress towards clarification of the UFO question by virtue of the fact that they'd not be fighting uphill against that kind of thinking that the United States Air Force handling of the problem has engendered here. An encouraging new UFO investigation is just now being organized with the Institute for Aerospace Studies at the University of Toronto, and I had an opportunity to confer with scientists beginning that study. Quite recently, indications of a similar study being developed in France have appeared. The Russian position remains unclear. The types of UFO reports that are most intriguing and point most directly to extraterrestrial hypothesis are close-range sightings of machine-like objects of unconventional nature and unconventional performance characteristics seen at low altitudes, and sometimes even on the ground. The general public is entirely unaware of the large number of reports that are coming from credible witnesses because ridicule and scoffing have made most witnesses reluctant to report openly such unusual incidents. When one starts searching for such cases, their numbers are quite astonishing. Also, such sightings appear to be occurring all over the globe, possibly with increasing frequency in the past year, an inference based on uncertain data because the ridicule lid seems to be lifting off of late. This may simply be bringing a larger fraction of such incidents to light. Examples will be presented. Suggestions that such observations can be explained away in terms of meteorological optics, in parentheses Menzel's principal thesis, or in terms of plasma, in parentheses again Klass principal thesis, cannot be supported without scientific arguments. The recently published book by Klass, UFOs Identified, is filled with erroneous conceptions and with qualitative arguments that fall apart on assessing them in quantitative terms. Examples will be presented. Many obvious questions and challenges can be and must be raised against the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Why no contact? Why no crashed UFOs? Why aren't there a lot of good photos if UFOs are real? Why aren't UFOs seen in cities rather than in remote deserts and swamps? How can we be sure UFO sightings aren't hallucinations? Why no sonic booms? And can one account for non-inertial turns and maneuvers? Why don't optical tracking programs, such as meteor survey programs, photograph UFOs? Why don't our radar fences and high-altitude radar search systems see UFOs? If not of intrasolar system origin, how could UFOs accomplish interstellar transits of reasonable times? Where could they be coming from? How is it possible that other military radar systems throughout the world have failed to detect UFOs if they are real? Why aren't they seen by airline pilots and military pilots? Why aren't they seen by astronauts in orbit? Why aren't UFOs seen occasionally by large crowds of people rather than by single witnesses? To these and related questions, there exist some quite good answers and some possible relevant speculative answers. In some cases, there exist no satisfactory answers. The first step in accelerating UFO research is to carefully review the existing evidence in order to design new sensors. Electromagnetic effects accompanying UFO sightings offer real promise herein. To add to already existing radar networks, data from latter networks should be brought under scientific scrutiny to search for systemic patterns of UFO appearances of movements. Present anecdotal data plus revealed radar data are inadequate to define such patterns accurately due to the ridicule lid effect acting on non-random filters. Following design of sensor networks specifically planned for UFO detection, a host of other UFO investigations would naturally follow. A few specific examples of the latter will be cited. And finally, as a low-cost, minimal-level precursor to such efforts to obtain instrumental monitoring of UFOs, it is urged that various organizations and agencies take steps to establish exploratory UFO study programs, even if these involve only 2 or 3 scientists per program. Any aerospace organization or agency that is interested in organizing such a small internal study can secure assistance, etc., in getting in touch with me. The immediate need to establish a broader base of scientific recognition of the astonishing nature of the existing UFO evidence. Scientific scoffing at UFOs has gone on long enough. Serious attention is long overdue. AIAA could perform a very unusual and useful role in stimulating new and vigorous examinations of this intriguing yet neglected scientific problem. So here you have, again, this is a paper, a lecture titled Are UFOs Extraterrestrial Surveillance Craft from March 1968 by Dr. James McDonald, a brilliant, courageous man who studied and put things forward. And I, like I said, I hope I can learn things from his bravery. But he wasn't afraid to ask questions, even in the face of adversity. And for that, I am eternally grateful as I look forward to learning more and pushing boundaries. I also want to just thank from the bottom of my heart people like Anne Druffel, who have spent decades researching this, meeting people, talking to people, interviewing people that have such great insight. We can all learn so much from history and the wonderful researchers who have dedicated their lives to pushing boundaries. I can't tell you, as cynical as I have become sometimes, I can't look you in the eye and say that I don't think there is something here that is interacting with us. I believe that there is. I don't know what it is. But because of the things that I personally have witnessed in my life and having talked to many, many other people, I will continue to pursue that and learn from Dr. James McDonald, from Anne Druffel. And I want to thank each and every one of you so much for your support, for your love. I hope all of you are safe. I will be, like I said, playing more clips as the weeks progress. And I promise you I will get better at my audio. I don't know. Anyways, stay safe, all of you. And make sure you go to UFOclassified.com Much love, and I will catch you next Friday.